Hello, and welcome to this clothing tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be making a bunny suit. As far as clothes go, it's on the simpler side of things. That being said, there are still things you can learn here, like for example, how to make stockings or how to add seams to your model. This video is mostly aimed at beginners though. Not complete beginners, like I expect that you know how to use the basic tools in Blender, like extrude and move vertices around, things like that. But anyway, if clothes intimidate you, I hope it can provide some encouragement. So as I start modeling here, I just want to point out there are so many clothes. Like clothes are almost their own kinds of characters. If you feel like you don't know how to make clothes, really you should focus on your Blender fundamentals. Much like characters, but even more so for clothes, each piece of cloth poses its own challenges that are unique to that piece of clothing. Now, there's going to be some overlap, obviously, at some point, but what I'm trying to say is that there's never going to be a tutorial for every piece of clothing you're going to need to make. Ultimately, learning how to make clothes is learning how to model complex 3D shapes. So anyway, don't get discouraged, keep working at it, and I'm sure you're going to get results eventually. Now, broadly speaking, I think there's three types of clothing. There's skin-tight clothing, there's semi-loose clothing, and then there's loose clothing. Skin-tight is what we're making here, and it's also the easiest type. The reason should be evident from this time lapse. All the hard work is basically done for us. The shape of the clothing is primarily given by the body mesh, so all you really have to worry about is the topology. In many cases, you can even copy the body mesh and use that as a piece of clothing. In my opinion, all you have to think about when you make skin-tight clothing is two things. First, you want to keep the quads even, and second, you want to keep the edge flow appropriate. Just like the body mesh, the clothes need to deform. That means they're subject to the same topological considerations as the body mesh. So you want joints where there are joints, and you want clean edge flow. So yeah, beyond that, for skin-tight clothing, I'm struggling a little bit to come up with good tips. Whether it's going to look good or not really comes down to two things, and that is materials and shape design. I'll give you some tips about materials a little bit later. As for shape design, it's not really my strong suit. I would say if you're trying to improve your shape design, try to simplify your shapes. Simple shapes like spheres, rectangles, and triangles are a really good starting point for any design. For example, in the bunny suit, you can see that we have a triangle around the crotch and two spheres around the breasts. This gives the suit a distinctive shape, and it's really readable as well. If you're designing your own clothes, try to have these set piece simple shapes. But yeah, like I said, I'm not very good at shape design, so this is really all I got. Let's talk a little bit about the actual modeling next. You'll notice I haven't really talked much about what I'm actually doing in the time lapse, and that's because what I'm doing is very basic. There is some decision making, of course, on how to lay out the edge loops. For example, on the boundaries, I know generally speaking I want a loop that traces the boundary. This is because as the final step, I'm going to extrude these boundaries to add a bit more volume to them. I don't know what this effect is called in real life, but real clothes are made like this. So they have like a thick outline basically around the boundaries so that they're harder to tear. One thing I want to mention here is the discussion of whether cloth layers should respect one another. What I mean by that is, for example, let's say we have a bra, we have the bunny suit, and then we have the skin. So should these layers basically exist on top of each other? So should I be able to have all these objects visible at the same time and not clipping, and basically for everything to look fine? Your first instinct might be yes, of course, but actually it's very common for people to delete the geometry that's not visible. You can do this, for example, with the mask modifier. Deleting the geometry gives you more control of the shape because it doesn't have to conform to the actual shape of the body that's beneath. You can basically design the clothes independently of the base mesh. Generally speaking, I would recommend using the mask modifier whenever you feel like you need it. The exception, of course, is when you know that the undergarments or the naked body are going to have to be shown at some point. In that case, I do recommend trying to make the clothes work without the mask modifier. Of course, if you have many layers, it might not be possible. One other option is to try to shrink the base mesh when there's something on top, for example with a lattice modifier. In this instance, I used a lattice modifier to make the breasts smaller when they're in the bunny suit. I find that that just makes it look more natural. But anyway, in this instance, I am also try to keep the option of having the skin beneath the bunny suit be visible and not be masked. I believe that there's a place for nudity in art, and certainly in my art there is some nudity sometimes, so I want to keep that option open for me. But yeah, you'll notice that there's a lot of fiddling to make sure that the skin is not clipping through the bunny suit. Just remember that the sculpt tool is your friend here, and if you need precise control, you should go into edit mode and do things that way. Another thing that might help you is the displace modifier, which moves the mesh along its normals. I didn't use it here, I just wanted to mention it in case you're having trouble. It might help you. Okay, but that's pretty much all I had to say about the torso. Let's talk about the stockings now. So for the stockings, I basically copied the legs, and I'm faking the stockings with a material. You could try to model the stockings as an object. I actually did that first. I didn't really like how it looked though, and as far as performance goes, it's so much more performant to use a texture than to actually model it in. Like, it's a lot of geometry to have the stockings be fine. If you want to model the stockings as an object, the way I would recommend you do it is you make even quads in the area where the stockings exist, then you use the poke faces command, and then you use the wireframe command. This is probably the quickest and dirtiest way to do it, but the results are also not that good. If you want it to be more fancy, you could do it in geometry nodes, but let's leave that for another video. Tell me in the comments if you want me to do that. So anyway, let me walk you through the texture solution. Let's take this one step at a time. So for this method to work, you need proper UVs. I'm showing you the seams that I've placed here, if you want to copy them. Okay, so getting back to the node graph, first section here that I'm highlighting splits the UV map into multiple cells. Each of these cells is going to contain a segment of the stocking. The next section is a little bit harder to explain. Let's begin by looking at these two rows of 5 nodes. I'll plug them into our surface output so we can actually see what they contain. So basically each one of these 5 nodes creates a sign pattern. The way this is done is by taking the distance of the x coordinate multiplied by a number and the y coordinate multiplied by 2 pi. The number that multiplies the x coordinate just determines the shape of the sign. The only difference between the bottom row and the top row of those 5 nodes is that one is offset by pi. That means that when we add the two signs together, we get this sort of circle shape. At this point, we have the basic stocking shape. By passing it through a color ramp, I set the colors of the stocking and the skin beneath. By passing it through a bump node, we get a normal map to fake a little bit of depth. You'll notice that we're adding another component to the input of the bump map. This is the inverted stocking shape. What this does is effectively give a little bit of bump to the skin in the middle of each ring. Finally, you'll notice I'm passing the stocking shape into the roughness as well. I'm inverting it before I pass it though, so that the stocking is really slippery or not rough, and the skin is really rough. And yeah, that's basically it. Now, this material is not without its problems. If I zoom in, you'll see it right away that the stocking is not actually smooth, and neither is the skin. From far away, it's not really noticeable though, so I'm letting it slide. By the way, if you're having trouble following this step to make the stockings, don't worry. You can basically get the same effect, or maybe even better, just by using a stocking texture. I'm just a Puritan and I like to do things procedurally. So basically, all you have to do is find a stocking texture and replace the node that gives the stocking shape with your texture. Okay, just a couple of final tips before I move on from the stockings. Just like we've done here, make sure that preferably your material has a normal map, a roughness variation, and a variation in the base color. Even if the variation is given by a very coarse noise texture, I think it still adds something to the image to have that variation. When it comes to the roughness, think about what areas of the mesh you want to be rough and which areas you want to be non-rough. Okay, and that's pretty much all I had for general tips. So at this point, the main outfit has been completed. We just need a couple of accessories. The first of these is the shoes, and this is really as simple as it gets. I basically made my character these slippers. I think they look good with the bunny suit. With the feet especially, I think the mask modifier is really a must. Shoes tend to look best when they're shaped, and so for that reason you really want the freedom to actually design them without having to conform to the shape of the foot. But yeah, there is literally nothing special about these slippers. Next we have the bunny ears, because you gotta have bunny ears with a bunny suit, of course. I just basically did the whole thing freestyle. These are very simple shapes after all. Basically, I'm just extruding a single edge over and over. Like, I don't know what you want me to say here. Then we have the choker. Gotta have that. This is just a cylinder that is shrink wrapped onto the neck. And finally, we have these cuffs. I don't know what they're really called. I often see these in anime. So the way I'm thinking about this is that the far end is shrink wrapped to the hand because it's kind of attached. It's a solid part. And the rest of the cuff is kind of like cloth, so it flows a bit more freely. Going back to what I said before about modeling being the process of modeling complex 3D shapes, you really see it here. Not because the shapes are so complex, but because the shapes are sort of arbitrary, right? Like they're what this particular piece of clothing needs, right? Every piece of clothing is going to have its own bits and bobs like this. That's why I think you should really focus on the fundamentals if you're trying to learn how to model clothes better. But anyway, hopefully you can handle the cuffs without me going through it step by step. So there's one last thing that I want to cover in this video, and that is how to add seams. Now, 3D might have trained you to think of seams as a bad thing, but seams are actually really useful for adding realism to a piece of clothing. Anyway, at least in my case, I want some seams, so let's see how we can add some. Now, at this point, I think I should confess that I haven't actually found a super good way to add seams yet. Generally speaking, the way I do it is I either model the seams in or I use textures. And by textures, I mean a bump map. So let me show you the texture method. So go to the material that you want to add seams to, add a bump map, and plug in an image texture. Make sure that your image texture has enough resolution. I found that for the most part, you need a 4K texture to actually get good seams with this method. Okay, now hop into texture paint mode, set your stroke to line, and set your fall off as I show in the video. Now you should be able to draw seams onto your model. Remember to adjust the strength of the bump map to your liking. And that's pretty much it for this method. You might want to use the soften or the smear brush to try to touch up the seams a little bit. I don't know. As you can see, this method doesn't really give amazing looking seams, but hey, if it works, it works. Alright, so that's basically it for this tutorial. Well, this was more of a watch me do a thing video than a tutorial, but I did try to make it as educational as I could. Let me know in the comments if this video helped you or what I could have done better. I mean, I'm still learning here. If I do more cloth tutorials in the future, I will cover the two other types of clothes that I mentioned. So semi-loose clothes and loose clothes. So this would be, for example, dresses and loose-fitting clothes, baggy clothes, things like that. In the meantime, I will actually be making some more clothes on the channel when I tackle my next character. So if you're really struggling with clothes, maybe there's going to be some tips for you there. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.